I took the job at the Halvorsen Processing Center because it was the only place that called me back, and because they didn't ask me a single question that mattered. That's the truth I've never told anyone. By the time I walked into that building, I had stopped expecting anything good to find me. I'd co-signed a loan for my brother 2 years before, the kind of favor you do without thinking because he was family and because I believed people paid back what they owed. He didn't. The debt rolled downhill until it landed on me, and then the courts got involved, and then a portion of every paycheck I would ever earn started getting taken before I even saw it. Wage garnishment. There's a calm, bureaucratic horror to those words that I didn't understand until it was happening to me. You work a full shift, you earn the money, and a part of it simply never arrives. It goes somewhere else. It was decided already, before you clocked in. So when Halvorsen offered me a back-office clerk position, 2 in the afternoon to 11 at night, processing claims and records that nobody ever thanked me for, I said yes before the woman on the phone finished the sentence. The pay was modest but steady, and steady was all I needed. I had 14 months left on the garnishment. I had done the math so many times, it lived behind my eyes. 14 months and then the money would be mine again, and I could start being a person instead of a line item on someone else's ledger. The building was an old textile mill out past Route 9, in the part of town where the streetlights thin out, and the businesses have names that don't tell you what they do. 4 stories of brick that had been gutted and refilled with carpet tiles and drop ceilings and fluorescent light. The company that leased it handled insurance adjudication and benefit records, the slow gray paperwork of other people's misfortunes. Somebody got hurt, somebody died, somebody filed, and eventually a file landed on a desk like mine and I moved it along to wherever files went. It was the most invisible work I could imagine, and at the time that suited me fine. I had spent 2 years feeling like I didn't matter to anyone. A job where mattering wasn't required felt almost like mercy. The first thing you learned about the building was its rhythm. Days were loud, full of people, the parking lot packed, the elevators always busy, but my shift caught the back half. The slow drain of the place, as the day crowd left and the building emptied out around me. By 7 in the evening, it was mostly the night clerks, a skeleton of supervisors, and the hum of the air handlers. That hum changed at 7. I noticed it my first week. Right around the hour, the building shifted into what one of the older clerks called reduced occupancy mode, and the HVAC dropped into a lower pitch, a kind of long exhale that settled into the walls and stayed there until morning. After a while, you stopped hearing it. After a while, you only noticed when it wasn't there. There was a break room on the second floor with 2 vending machines and a clock on the wall that ran 4 minutes fast. I mention it because it was the first thing that struck me as strange in a place full of strange things I hadn't learned to see yet. 4 minutes fast, every day, and nobody fixed it. I asked about it once, early on, and a woman warming up her soup said, "Oh, that clock, yeah," and went back to her soup. That was the whole answer. As if a clock being wrong was a fact of nature, like weather. I reset it myself one night when I had nothing better to do, climbed up on a chair and turned the little dial on the back, and the next afternoon it was 4 minutes fast again. I told myself someone had reset it. I told myself a lot of things in those days. The mail moved through the building 2 ways. There was a physical cart that a clerk pushed floor to floor, dropping inter-office envelopes into trays, and there was the tube system. An old pneumatic network left over from some earlier life of the building, brass-capped ports at the end of certain hallways that swallowed a canister and sent it somewhere with a sound I can still hear if I let myself. A soft thunk as it seated, then a long hiss as the air took it. The envelopes were all the same. Manila, with a little cardboard button and a length of red string you wound around it to close the flap, and a routing grid printed on the front. A grid of small boxes where someone had once written initials and dates, so a piece of paper could find its way through a building full of people who never spoke to each other. I handled hundreds of them in my first month and thought nothing of any of it. They were furniture. They were the texture of the work. It was the smell that started everything, though I didn't know it at the time. About 3 weeks in, working late on the freight side of the building where the old elevator was, I noticed an odor I couldn't place. Wet paper, mostly. The smell of documents that had been water damaged and dried out and gotten damp again, that mildewed cardboard reek that gets into the back of your throat. But underneath it, threaded through it, was something else. A faint copper tang, like you'd been handling coins all day and then touched your tongue. Wet paper and pennies. That was how I described it to myself, standing there by the freight shaft, and I assumed it was a plumbing problem, or mold, or something rotting down in the basement where the records were kept. The kind of thing a building like that always has. The kind of thing you report. The freight elevator went down to a level marked B, but the staff elevator I usually rode didn't stop there without a key. I noticed that too, the little keyhole below the B button where the other buttons just lit up when you pressed them. The basement was a place that existed but that you weren't meant to go, and at first that seemed ordinary. Records retention, HVAC equipment, the boring guts of an old building. Why would I need to go there? The smell came up the freight shaft after 7 when the air handlers shifted, and I figured the change in air pressure was pulling it up from below. It was a reasonable thought. I had a lot of reasonable thoughts that turned out to be wrong. Marie worked the records department, and her shift overlapped the tail end of the day and the front of mine, so for a couple of hours each afternoon, we shared the same gray corner of the second floor. She was in her late 50s, had been at Halvorsen longer than anyone I ever met, and she had a way of being kind that was so worn down it almost looked like indifference. She kept a child's drawing taped to the side of her monitor, a stick figure thing in green crayon that she said her granddaughter made, and she had a tremor in her right hand that she blamed on too much coffee. She drank an enormous amount of coffee, so maybe she was right. I mentioned the smell to her one afternoon, just making conversation, the way you do. I said something about the basement, about reporting the mildew before it got into the ductwork. She didn't look up from her files right away. When she did, her face had changed in a small way. I didn't have the experience yet to read. She said, "You don't want to do that." I asked her what she meant. "Report it. It's just mold. It's a safety thing." And she said, "You let the building keep its own house. You don't go writing to them about what's downstairs." Then she went back to her files, and her hand was shaking a little more than usual, and she set down her coffee like the cup had gotten heavy. I filed that under the strangeness of old-timers. Every long-tenured employee at any job collects a little folklore, little superstitions about how things are done, and I figured Marie's was just don't make waves, don't bother management, keep your head down, which, given my situation, was advice I was already living by. But there was something in the way she said them, like the word them was a specific thing, a department, a presence, not just the vague management you complain about in a parking lot. You don't go writing to them. I didn't understand yet that the building had a them, that it could receive a letter and answer it. A few nights later, I found the basement door unlocked. Not the elevator, the stairwell. There was a fire stairwell on the freight side that ran the full height of the building, and the door at the bottom that led into B was supposed to be secured, I assumed, like everything else down there. But that night it stood open a few inches, and warm air was coming through the gap, warmer than the rest of the building, carrying that wet paper and pennies smell stronger than I'd ever caught it. On the door, stenciled in old paint that had been painted over and was bleeding back through, were 2 letters and a dash. R, dash. I didn't know what it meant. Records retention, I guessed, and I was right about that much, but I didn't go in. I stood at the gap and felt the warm air on my face and the smell filling my head, and something in me, some animal part that was smarter than my reasonable thoughts, told me to step back. So I stepped back. I pulled the door until I heard it catch, and I went back upstairs, and I told myself I'd report the door too, the mildew and the unsecured door. 2 things now. A list was forming. I want to be honest about why I filed the complaint, because it matters. It wasn't just the smell or the door. It was that for the first time in 2 years, I had the chance to be the one who said something. My whole life had become a series of things happening to me that I had no say in. The loan, the courts, the garnishment, the marriage that didn't so much end as quietly run out of fuel one Tuesday with no argument at all. I had become a man. Things were decided about. And here was a building doing something wrong, something I could see and smell and put my finger on, and I could make it answer for itself. I could be a person who reported a problem and made it get fixed. It felt, God help me, like dignity. It felt like the bravest thing I'd done in a long time. The complaint form was strange in a way I should have paid more attention to. Everything else in that building had gone digital, the badges, the timekeeping, but the safety complaint was a paper form, an old triplicate carbon thing you filled out by hand, so it printed through onto a pink copy and a yellow copy underneath. The language on it was formal in an old-fashioned way, and there was a field near the top that I stared at for a while because I didn't understand it. It said, subject of record, and a blank line after it. I didn't know what to put there. I wrote my own name, because I was the one filing, and the subject of the complaint was my concern, so it seemed like the closest thing to write. I described the smell and the unsecured door. I dated it, I signed it, and I rolled it into a canister and sent it through the tube to the routing code printed on the wall card for facilities and HR. The thunk, the hiss, gone. I felt good. I actually felt good. I went home that night lighter than I'd been in weeks. For 3 days, nothing happened, and then the building started to change around me in ways so small I kept talking myself out of noticing them. The clerks who'd nodded at me in the hall stopped nodding. Not cold, exactly, just absent, their eyes sliding off me like I'd developed an outline they preferred not to look directly at. Garrett, my supervisor, came by my desk on the second day. Garrett was a golf shirt kind of manager, a man who said, "Let's circle back and I'll loop you in," and seemed to have no inner life at all, which I'd always found restful. He leaned on the edge of my desk and said, "I saw you opened a case." And I said, "A complaint, yeah, about the basement." And he looked at me with something that wasn't quite concern, more like the patience you'd show a man who'd done something irreversible without realizing it. He said, "Opened a case," and then he straightened up and said, "Good for you for following procedure," and walked off. The word case stuck to me. I hadn't opened a case. I'd filed a complaint, but everyone kept calling it a case, and the tube system, which used to deliver to the port near my desk a dozen times a shift, went quiet. For 3 days, nothing came up the tube for me at all. On the 4th day, the envelope arrived. I heard the canister seat in the port with that soft thunk and the hiss release behind it, and I went and pulled it out and unscrewed the cap, and inside was one of the manila inner office envelopes, button and string, routing grid on the front. My name was on it, written by hand in the first box of the grid. I unwound the string and lifted the flap and slid out a single sheet of heavy paper, and it took my brain a long moment to understand what my eyes were looking at, because it was so completely outside what I expected that there was no slot for it to fall into. It was a death certificate. A real one, or a perfect copy of one, with the seal embossed in the corner so the paper rose up under my thumb, with a notary's stamp and a signature, with a case number printed across the top that started with R, dash, and my name. My full legal name, the one almost nobody used, the one on the court documents. My date of birth, correct, and a date of death, and the date of death was not in the future. It was 3 years in the past. It was a date from before I had ever heard of Halvorsen, before the loan even defaulted, a date when I had been alive and well, and entirely unaware that any of this existed. The cause of death was written in small clinical language. I had to read 3 times, and even then it didn't resolve into a sentence I could understand. Something about resolution of an open matter, something administrative dressed up in the words doctors use. At the bottom, in the same hand that had written my name on the envelope, someone had checked a box that said file completed. I want to tell you I panicked, but I didn't, not at first. The mind protects itself. My first clean thought was that it was a prank, a hazing thing they did to new hires, a sick joke. My second thought, close behind, was that someone had made a clerical error, mixed up a real decedent's file with my employee record, and that I would walk this down to HR and we would all have an uncomfortable laugh about it. I held on to that. I held on to it walking down the hall with the certificate in my hand, because the alternative was a door I wasn't ready to open. I found Garrett first. I put the certificate on his desk and I said, "Somebody needs to explain this to me." He picked it up and he read it, and his face did almost nothing. He set it down gently, the way you'd set down something you didn't want to crease, and he said, "Oh, your file's been completed. That's good, actually. It means your case is progressing." He said it the way you'd tell someone their loan application had moved to the next stage. I said, "Garrett, this is a death certificate, with my name on it, dated 3 years ago." And he looked at me with that same patient absence and said, "I know. It's a little unsettling the first time, you'll see." And he picked up his phone because it had buzzed, and that was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. The floor went out from under me right there, not because of the certificate, but because of how normal it was to him, because it was a thing that happened here, because there was a first time. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my apartment doing the only thing I knew how to do, which was to make it a problem I could solve. I'd take it to the police. But say what, exactly? A document with my name on it had upset me. I'd quit. But 14 months. The number that lived behind my eyes had become a cage so familiar I'd stopped feeling the bars. If I quit, the garnishment didn't stop, the debt didn't stop, it just kept growing in the dark while I had no income to feed it. I would lose everything I'd already paid down. I would be starting over from worse than zero. I lay there and did the math I always did, and the math said stay. The math always said stay, and I hated the math and I obeyed it, the way I'd obeyed every number that had ever been decided about me. The next afternoon I waited for Marie, and when she came in I asked her to sit with me, and I showed her the certificate. She didn't touch it. She looked at it lying on the desk, and then she looked at her own hands in her lap and she said, "You filed, didn't you?" Not a question. I said I had. She was quiet for a while, and then she said the thing I've never been able to forget. She said, "Once it's open, it has to close. There's only 2 ways a case closes here." I waited for the second way. I asked her, "What are the 2 ways?" And she pressed her lips together and shook her head, just slightly, and she said, "You don't need the second one. You just keep it from getting there." And then, like she needed to be somewhere else inside her own head, she told me her daughter was getting married in the spring, out at a barn venue she couldn't afford, and that she'd been saving for the dress. Her hand was trembling so badly she had to set her coffee down. I realized, sitting there, that in 22 years Marie had never once filed a complaint. That this was not advice she was giving me from the outside. It was the survival she had practiced her whole career, the discipline of never asking the building to account for itself, and she had broken it, just barely, just enough to warn me, and it was costing her something to do it. I should have listened to her and gone quiet and prayed it would lose interest. Instead, I went looking. The need to understand was stronger than the fear, which is the kind of flaw that gets people killed, and I knew that even then. There was a window in my shift, around 9 at night, when the records floor emptied out completely, and I could move through it without anyone asking what I was doing. The retention files were kept on the second floor in long rows of cabinets, with the older material archived down in B, but a lot of the recent history was right there upstairs if you knew how it was organized, and after a month of moving paper I knew how it was organized. I went looking for case files that started with R, dash, the prefix on my certificate, and I found them. Not a few, a wall of them, decades of them. I pulled drawer after drawer and read until my eyes burned, and a pattern assembled itself out of the paper, slow and undeniable. Each RR file began with a complaint. Someone reported a smell, a draft, a flickering light, an unsecured door, a noise in the walls, a sub-basement that wasn't on any map. Ordinary safety concerns, the kind any worker in any building might raise. And each complaint had triggered the opening of an RR case in the complainant's own name, and each case had a completion date. And next to many of the names, in a later hand, someone had written a disposition, transferred, retired, separated, resolved. I cross-checked a few against the employee photos still on file, and I recognized faces. A maintenance man I'd assumed had moved on. A clerk who Garrett had once mentioned, "Oh, she's not with us anymore," in a voice that I'd taken to mean she'd quit. And in one of the oldest folders, from a complaint filed before I was born, there was a group photograph of staff standing in front of the building when it was newer, and in the back row, slightly out of focus, was a woman I had seen. A woman who sat at a desk on the 3rd floor west wing, in the corner where the fluorescent tube always flickered, at a desk that I'd been told was unassigned. She was in a photograph from decades ago, and she was at her desk last week. I stood there holding that folder, and the smell of wet paper and pennies was suddenly very strong, stronger than I'd ever smelled it on the 2nd floor, as if reading the files had called it up out of the building, and I understood that I was not special. I was not the first man to feel brave by filing a form. I was a recurrence. The building had done this many, many times, and it was patient, and it was extremely good at it, and it had a whole history of men exactly like me who had thought they could be the one to make it answer. I put the folders back exactly as I'd found them, which felt important in a way I couldn't name, and I went back to my desk, and I sat very still. That was when I started to notice the changes in myself, and those frightened me worse than any document ever could. The first one came out of my own mouth. A clerk asked me whether a batch of files had been routed, and I heard myself say, "It's already been handled," the phrase Marie used. The phrase the whole staff used in their slightly wrong way. It came out of me automatically, in a flat tone that wasn't mine, and I caught it the way you catch yourself sleepwalking, with a lurch of wrongness. I hadn't decided to say it. It had said itself. Then the smell stopped bothering me. I'd walk past the freight shaft and breathe in the wet paper and the pennies and feel nothing, no recoil, no unease, the way you stop smelling your own home. Then my coffee stopped tasting like anything. I'd take a sip and there'd be heat, and that was all. No bitterness, no flavor, just warm water in my mouth. And then, one night, I lost time. I clocked in at 2, I sat down at my desk, and the next thing I knew, clearly it was past 8 and the floor had emptied and there were files completed in my out tray that I had no memory of touching, processed neatly in my own handwriting. The punch clock showed I'd been working the whole time. The work was done well. I just hadn't been there for it. Some part of me had kept moving the paper along while the rest of me was gone somewhere, and I had the cold thought that this was what completion looked like from the inside. Not a death, a subtraction. The slow removal of the parts of you that noticed anything, until what was left could be filed. I was becoming invisible again. That was the cruelest part, the part that found the exact shape of the wound I'd carried in. For 2 years I'd felt like a man no one saw, a line item, a non-event, and I'd wanted so badly to matter, to be accounted for, to have a file thick enough that someone would have to acknowledge I existed. And the one institution that finally saw me completely, that had a death certificate on me before I ever walked through the door, was using that file to erase me. Being seen here was the danger. My whole life of being invisible had been the only thing keeping me safe, and the moment I'd raised my hand and asked to be acknowledged, the building had acknowledged me right into a drawer. There was a new hire that week. His name was Cody, he was 22, and he was so alive it hurt to look at him. He talked constantly, asked questions nobody asked, brought in a little speaker, and played music at his desk, until a supervisor told him to use headphones, and even then, you could see his head bobbing. He was in full color against the gray of the rest of us. He reminded me of myself 14 months earlier, before the place had started taking pieces, and watching him, I felt the first thing I'd felt for another human being in a long time, which was the urge to protect him. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to grab him by the collar and say, "Don't file anything, don't report anything, don't ask the building to account for itself no matter what you see. Just keep your head down and do your 14 months and get out." But I couldn't make the words come. Every time I tried, my throat would close, and what came out instead was something flat and useless like, "Hey, keep it simple around here. You know, don't make extra work for yourself." He'd grin and say, "Sure thing, man," and I'd feel the warning dissolve before it ever reached him, and I started to suspect that the building didn't let those words out, that it had ways of keeping its history from spreading, that the silence of every employee who'd ever survived was not entirely a choice. I decided I needed to find whoever was above this. There had to be a person. The certificate had a notary signature. The envelopes had a hand that wrote my name. Someone in that building was the source of it, and if I could find them, maybe I could appeal, maybe I could withdraw the complaint and close the case the harmless way, whatever Marie's first way was. I asked around, carefully, who handled HR after hours, who'd sent me the certificate, and the answers kept circling to one name, Mr. Pell, the facilities and HR liaison. He worked odd hours. Nobody was sure exactly when. His office was on a half floor between the 3rd and 4th levels that I hadn't even known existed, reachable by a short flight of stairs off the freight landing. I went up after 10 o'clock, when the building was at its emptiest, and his door was open and his light was on, and he was sitting at a desk waiting in a way that made it clear he'd known I was coming, the way you know the next item in a queue is about to reach the window. The office was cold, several degrees colder than the rest of the building, and it had no personal effects at all. No photos, no plant, no coffee cup, nothing that said a human being spent time there. Just a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and an out tray heaped with manila envelopes, dozens of them, each one wound shut with red string, each one waiting to go somewhere. He gestured for me to sit. He was an unremarkable man, middle-aged, neat, with a face you'd forget the second you turned away, and he spoke quietly and reasonably, and that was the most frightening thing about him, that there was nothing to push against. I told him I wanted to withdraw my complaint. He folded his hands and said, "The matter's already been opened. We don't withdraw an open case." I said then, "I want to close it. Tell me how to close it." And he said, "Closure isn't something we do to you. It's something that completes." He said it kindly, almost gently, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he's delivered 1,000 times. I asked him who he reported to, who I could appeal to above him, and he looked at me with what might have been genuine sympathy and said there wasn't anyone above the procedure. The procedure was the thing itself. He didn't run it. He served it the way I served it, the way everyone in the building served it, whether they knew it or not. And then he said, "You've been reading the old files. It's natural to want to understand, but understanding doesn't change the disposition. It only changes how quietly you go. and he picked up the next envelope from his stack and turned his attention to it, and I understood I'd been dismissed, that there was no higher floor, no manager, no appeal, that the building did not have a head you could cut off. It had a process, and a process cannot be reasoned with because it has no reasons, only steps. I think I knew, walking down from his office, that I was going to go into the basement. I'd been circling it for weeks the way you circle a thing you're afraid of, and I understood now that the answer, whatever it was down there, and that I couldn't keep being subtracted by inches without at least seeing the place where the subtraction ended. I waited until the floor was empty, near 11, near the end of my shift, and I took the freight stairwell down, flight after flight, the air growing warmer and thicker as I descended, the wet paper and pennies smell wrapping around me, and at the bottom the door with the R stenciled on it stood open the same few inches it had that first night, as if it had been waiting, as if it was always waiting. I went in. The basement was rows and rows of filing cabinets stretching back farther than the building should have allowed, farther than the footprint above could possibly contain, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing in long banks, half of them dead, so that the rows alternated between sick light and full dark. The smell was everything down there. It was the air itself, the wet paper and the copper, and underneath the hum of the lights, there was another sound I couldn't place at first, a soft, irregular shifting, like a great quantity of paper settling, like pages turning very slowly in a draft, except there was no draft. The air hung dead and warm and still. It took me a long time to understand that the sound was coming from the cabinets, that something inside them was moving, that the building down here was not silent but breathing, slow and patient, in through the paper and out through the paper. I walked the rows. The cabinets were labeled with case numbers, all of them RR- in a sequence with no end I could find, and here and there a drawer hung open, and I made myself look into one. I don't have good words for what was inside. It was files, packed tight, folders edge to edge, and it was also not files. There was a suggestion of a shape pressed into the paper, the way a body leaves a shape in a mattress, a hollow with the curve of a person in it, and when I leaned closer, the open drawer seemed to widen, the runners sliding without my touching them, opening like something opens that wants to take what's in front of it, and I stepped back fast and it stopped. On a hook at the end of that row hung a lanyard with a faded ID badge, and the name on it was a man I'd read about in the files upstairs, the clerk who'd had Garrett's job before Garrett, the one whose disposition said resolved, and his photo on the badge was smiling, and the lanyard hung there on its hook, the way a coat hangs in a closet of someone who isn't coming back. I didn't see a monster do anything. I want to be clear about that, because it's the part nobody believes. Nothing chased me. Nothing reached for me. What I saw was worse than a thing that chases you. I saw the end state. I saw what completion was. It was not death the way I'd imagined death. It was filing. The building took a person, and it processed them down through its stages until what was left of them could be stored, until they became a record of themselves, a shape in a drawer, a name on a hook, retained, not destroyed, kept, forever, in the warm dark, breathing slowly with all the others. And I understood, standing in that row, that the whole building above me, the desks and the carpet and the fluorescent light and the 4 minutes fast clock, all of it sat on top of this, was built around this, existed to feed this, and that everyone who worked there was somewhere on the slope down toward those drawers, and the only difference between us was how far we'd slid. I went back up the stairs and out into the parking lot, and I stood in the cold air for a long time, and I did not file a report about what I'd seen, because there was no one to file it to, because filing was the disease, because the only thing more dangerous than the basement was the form that sent you there. And in the days after, something in me settled into a terrible clarity. I stopped fighting the building, because you cannot fight a process, and I started thinking the way it thought. I went back through the old files, but now I wasn't reading them for understanding. I was reading them for the mechanism, for the seams, for the place where a clever and frightened man might wedge himself in and survive. Marie had said there were 2 ways a case closes, and she'd never tell me the second, but I'd seen the second now, down in the dark, and I didn't need her to name it. What I needed was the first. The way that wasn't completion. And the more I read, the more I understood it wasn't a way to close a case at all. It was a way to keep it open. An open case never completes. A case in motion, a case being routed and rerouted, perpetually in transit through the building's veins, never reaches the basement, because the basement is where cases go to be closed, and a case that never closes never gets there. The files told me how. There had always been a mail clerk, the person who pushed the cart and loaded the tubes and carried the manila envelopes from floor to floor, hand to hand, port to port, the person who kept everything moving, and in the personnel records, the mail clerks lasted far longer than anyone else, decades sometimes, their own cases logged as open, indefinitely open, perpetually in routing, because the building needed them to keep all the other cases moving and so it never let theirs complete. They were the circulatory system. And the current mail clerk's chair, I realized, had been empty for 2 weeks. I'd been so wrapped up in my own case I hadn't noticed the cart sitting idle, the tubes backing up, the envelopes piling in Pell's out tray with nowhere to go. The last mail clerk had stopped. Maybe he'd gotten tired. Maybe he'd let himself notice too much. And when a mail clerk stops moving, his case stops being in motion, and then it completes. And then there's a new lanyard on a hook downstairs, and an empty chair upstairs, and a great backlog of mail, with no one to carry it. The position was open, and I understood, with the cold math I'd always been good at, exactly what it was offering me. Pell called me up to his cold office the next night, and I think he'd been watching me arrive at the conclusion, the way you watch a man find the only exit in a room with no doors. He didn't gloat. He wasn't capable of gloating. He simply slid a form across the desk, a transfer of duties, and he said, "The mail needs to move. We've fallen behind. Your case stays open as long as the mail keeps moving." He said it like he was doing me a kindness, and the worst of it was that he was. I looked at the form. I thought about the 14 months, which by then had become 11, the cage of numbers that had marched me into this building in the first place. I thought about the basement, the shape in the drawer, the lanyard on the hook. I thought, just until the garnishment clears, just until I've paid it down and I can afford to walk away from worse than zero, just until then, I'll push the cart, I'll keep my own case in motion, I'll buy myself the time. It was the same reasonable thought I'd had at every step, the thought that always said stay, and I let it carry me one more time. I signed the transfer. Pell took it without a word and added it to a stack, and my case, somewhere in the bones of the building, shifted from completing to in transit, and I felt it. I swear I felt the slope I'd been sliding down level off under me, and I hated how good the relief felt. So, I became the man who moved the mail. I pushed the cart floor to floor, I loaded the canisters and listened to the thunk and the hiss as they vanished into the walls. I carried the manila envelopes with their red strings and their routing grids, and I learned not to read the names on them, because reading the names was a thing that would cost me, the way it had cost Marie to warn me, the way it cost everyone who let themselves notice. My coffee never tasted like anything again, but I stopped reaching for flavor. The smell never bothered me again, and I stopped expecting it to. I existed in the building's circulatory rhythm, in motion, always in motion, and as long as I kept everyone else's cases moving, mine stayed open, and open meant alive, or close enough to alive that I could go home and lie in my bed and tell myself the number was getting smaller. And then one afternoon an envelope came up the tube to my own cart, and it was addressed in the hand I'd come to know, the hand that wrote names on death certificates, and the name on it was Garrett's. I stood with it in my hands. Garrett, who'd told me my file being completed was a good thing, who'd said, "You'll see with that hollow patience." Garrett had slid all the way down at last. His case had reached its disposition, and the building had printed his completion and routed it to me to deliver, because I was the one who carried such things now. I could have not delivered it. I could have held it, hidden it, let it sit. But a held envelope is a case that stops moving, and the building does not tolerate a clerk who lets the mail back up, and if his case stopped moving in my hands, then mine would too, and we'd both go down together. So I carried it to his desk. He looked up at me, and there was almost nothing left in his face by then, and I set the envelope in his tray, and he said, "Thank you," the way you thank the mailman, and I walked away, and I didn't let myself feel it, because feeling it was a thing I could no longer afford. I told myself I was just routing mail. I told myself I didn't choose who, I only carried what the building decided. It was the same lie the garnishment had taught me, that there's no guilt in obeying a process you didn't design, that a man who only moves the paper isn't responsible for what the paper does. I'd resented that lie my whole adult life, the faceless system that had taken my wages without ever once meeting my eyes, and now I was inside the lie, I was the faceless hand, I was the thunk and the hiss, and I made my peace with it the way you make peace with anything you do every day. Cody filed a complaint. I found out when his envelope came up the tube. He'd reported the parking lot lights, half of them out, a safety concern, the kind of small, brave, reasonable thing a person does when they still believe a building will answer them honestly. The exact same instinct that had made me feel like a person again all those months ago, the same raising of the hand, the same asking to be accounted for. His canister seated in the port near my cart with that soft thunk and the hiss released behind it, and I pulled it out and unscrewed the cap, and there was the manila envelope, button and string, and his name written in the first box of the routing grid in that familiar hand, and inside it I knew without opening would be a death certificate with a date already passed and a case number starting RR, and a little box check that said file completed, and I stood there with it, this kid in full color who I'd wanted to protect, whose warning I'd never been able to get out of my throat, and I waited to feel the thing I knew I should feel, the grief, the refusal, the last spark of the man who'd walked into that building wanting to matter. I waited for it, and it didn't come. There was just the warm, still air and the weight of the envelope, and the long row of deliveries still ahead of me on the cart. I carried it to his desk. He was leaning back in his chair with his head bobbing to music only he could hear through his headphones. Alive, so alive. And I set the envelope in his tray, and he pulled one earbud out and grinned at me and said, "What's this, man?" And I said, "It's already been handled," in a voice that was flat and not mine and entirely mine, and I didn't flinch, and I walked back to my cart, and I kept the mail moving. The garnishment cleared 4 months ago. I did the math so many times over so many years that I felt the day it ended, felt the cage swing open, the last payment taken and the debt finally, completely paid. I was free. The number that had lived behind my eyes since before any of this began had finally counted down to 0, and the thing it had promised me, the freedom on the other side, was right there for the taking. I could have walked out. There was nothing financial holding me anymore, no court, no ledger, no portion of my wages disappearing before I saw it. I didn't walk out. I don't entirely know how to explain it, except that by then leaving had become its own kind of completion. A mail clerk who stops moving lets his case catch up to him. The freedom I'd spent 14 months working toward turned out to be a door that only opened onto the basement. So I stayed, and I keep the mail moving, and once a week I go down the freight stairwell into the warm dark, into the smell that no longer means anything to me, and I find the drawer with my own case number, RR, and the digits I know by heart now, and I take out my death certificate, the one with my name and my real birthday, and that date 3 years before I ever heard of this place, and I touch the little box that says file completed, and I keep it from being checked. I keep my own case open with my own hand. I am the subject of record and the clerk both. There's a kind of restfulness in it that I'm ashamed to admit, the way Garrett's emptiness was restful, the way Marie's worn-down kindness was the calm of someone who'd stopped fighting a long time ago. Marie retired in the spring. Her daughter got married. There's a new lanyard on a hook downstairs, and I don't go down that particular row. Cody's chair is empty now, and there was an opening posted last week for a back office clerk, 2 to 11, and a new person starts Monday. I saw him in the lobby being walked through orientation, young, tired, the specific kind of tired that means he needs the job, and didn't ask many questions when they offered it. I recognized the look. I wore it once, and this morning there was a fresh canister waiting in the tube at the start of my shift, a manila envelope inside with the button and the string and the routing grid, and the first box of the grid was blank, no name yet. Just an envelope waiting to be addressed, the way they always wait, the way the building is always patient, and I loaded it back into the tube and sent it on, and I listened to the thunk and the hiss as it went into the walls to wait for whoever raises their hand next, and I told myself the same thing I always tell myself, the only thing left that I can still almost believe, that I'm only moving the mail, that none of it was ever decided by me, that it's already been handled, and I went back to my cart, and I kept everything moving, and the building breathed slow around me, in through the paper, and out through the paper, and I no longer remember what coffee is supposed to taste like. And I think I'll be here a long, long time.